Michelle Shelly Knotek gave the impression of having a happy existence. She was raising her 3 girls in a house in Raymond, Washington, with who everyone thought was a loving spouse at her side. Known for their altruism, the couple seemed to welcome friends and family who were going through hard times to live with them. However, these visitors soon started to vanish. When the fate of her victims was discovered, investigations revealed how many shocking layers it really had. One where at the core lied the sick, twisted mind of a true monster who thrived from having total control over her multiple victims. How did a mother of 3 who on the surface appeared to be helpful to the vulnerable go down a path like this? This is the harrowing story of Michelle Shelly Knotek, which is a grotesque road filled with manipulation, degradation, and violence. A large chunk of this case was researched from the book by Gregg Olsen called If You Tell, A True Story of Murder, Family Secrets, and the Unbreakable Bond of Sisterhood. I highly recommend you read this book. It goes into much more detail than I could fit in this video. Now, with that out of the way, let's lift the thin veil. Born in 1954 in Raymond, a small city in Washington, Michelle Knotek, originally Michelle Watson, was nicknamed Shelly. Her childhood was not a stable one. Her biological mother, Sharon Watson, an alcoholic with mental health issues, abandoned her and her 2 younger brothers quite early in her life. They would be raised by their stepmother, Lynette Stallings, and their biological father, Les Watson. Shelly's father, a charming and successful businessman, helped his mother run 2 nursing homes and owned a thriving bowling alley. Before she met Les, Lynette worked at a restaurant and was saving money for college. Sharon wanted to get rid of Shelly and her brother Chuck, but kept the infant, Paul. At 6, Shelly and 3-year-old Chuck moved to their father and stepmother's home in Battleground, Washington. Soon after the move, Shelly developed a mean streak, telling Lynette how much she hated her almost every day. She controlled Chuck, cried out, threw objects, picked on her brother and stepmother, and showed violent tendencies when she didn't get her way. Lynette noted that Shelly had outbursts over the smallest things to manipulate those around her. Les, blinded by love for his daughter, gave Shelly whatever she wanted, ignoring her behavior. It wasn't just Shelly's dad who enabled her behavior. Her grandmother, Anna, played an equally significant role. Anna ruled her nursing homes with an iron fist. She treated her mostly young, vulnerable female staff horrifically. She would punch, kick, humiliate, and degrade any staff member who stepped out of line. She even made them wash her feet and shove their heads down the toilet as punishment. Despite her horrific actions, Anna was never held accountable. She wasn't just a tyrant at work. Anna exerted complete control over her family and friends as well, and she likely taught Shelly many of her manipulative tactics. Anna forced her husband, George, to sleep in a shed outside in the garden for 20 years of their marriage, enduring Washington's brutal winters. She would also humiliate and badmouth him to others. Although Anna would play nasty pranks on Shelly, like intentionally giving her bad haircuts, she was probably the only person Anna didn't severely abuse. The 2 were inseparable, but Shelly eventually outgrew her grandmother and became even worse. In the spring of 1967, when Shelly was 13, her biological mother was killed. Shelly showed little to no response, continuing as if her mother had never existed. This reaction was expected, as Sharon had never written or called after dropping Shelly off at her father's, not even for birthdays or holidays. In her teenage years, Shelly's behavior worsened. She broke bits of glass and left them inside her classmates' shoes, finding joy in their pain. In March 1969, when she was 15, Shelly's school superintendent called the Watson home to inform them that Shelly would not be returning. When Lynette and Les arrived at the school, they discovered Shelly was accusing Les of raping her. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Shelly had fabricated the story, having gotten the idea from someone else's account in a women's lifestyle magazine. In the summer of 1971, Shelly met her first husband, Randy Rivardo. and by February 1973, both aged 19, they got married and moved into a trailer in Battleground, Washington, owned by her father. They paid no rent, but Shelly hated everything about it. Randy got a low-paying job at Shelly's father's company, so Shelly remained dependent on her father for money, even asking for a car. When her father bought her a Buick instead of the Volkswagen she wanted, Shelly resorted to insulting and ridiculing him. Later, at home, she pretended to overdose on sleeping pills to gain Randy's sympathy. However, when the doctor pumped her stomach, he found she had only taken a couple of aspirin pills. On another occasion, Randy came home from work to find Shelly bloody and bruised, with their trailer completely trashed. Shelly claimed she was assaulted by an intruder. However, an investigation revealed that this was a lie. The injuries and damage were self-inflicted. There was no intruder. Shelly staged the scene because she wanted to move to a nicer part of town. Local businesses in Battleground complained that Shelly would run up tabs and never pay her bills. Eventually, most local businesses barred her, leaving the young couple extremely isolated. When Shelly was pregnant with their first child, Nikki, Randy's parents visited from Pennsylvania, but Shelly refused to socialize with them. Her family noted that her biggest concern was how the pregnancy would ruin her figure. It was clear that Shelly was not becoming a stable adult, and the prospect of her being responsible for another life terrified everyone close to her. She convinced her father to give Randy's paycheck to her directly and forced Randy to sleep in their car at night. Randy eventually left Shelly in 1976, which nobody blamed him for. However, she enacted one last act of revenge against him by taking out debts in his name, running away to Vancouver, Washington, and leaving Nikki in Battleground with her stepmother, Lynette, for over a year. In August 1978, Shelly married Danny Long, a man she'd met when she'd run off to Vancouver. This marriage was extremely troublesome and lasted 5 years, but they had a daughter named Samantha. Her grandmother had passed away right before their divorce and left her a house. Shelly was initially ecstatic, but that didn't last long, as she couldn't afford to maintain the house or pay the taxes. The house was going into receivership, meaning it was going to be possessed by the bank unless certain financial obligations were met. Getting a job to pay for the house was out of the question for Shelly. At the time of Shelly's divorce from Danny, she had already started seeing another man, Dave Knotek, whom she'd met a few months earlier in 1982. Dave was a simple man from Raymond who didn't grow up in a wealthy family. When he was a child, his only toys were made at home out of sticks and chicken feathers, and hand-me-downs were a constant in his family. After graduating high school in 1971, Dave followed in his father's footsteps and worked as a logger for a year before enlisting in the Navy. When he returned to Raymond, he was still young and considered good-looking, with a good job at a large timber company. He dated many girls on and off during that time. Although he was quite popular, his friends and family regarded him as a very timid person, an easy target to manipulate and take advantage of, especially for someone like Shelly. In August 1982, after a breakup, Dave drove to Long Beach, Washington, seeking its livelier nightlife. There, he met Shelly at a pub called the Sore Thumb. Interestingly, the Sore Thumb burned down the day after they met, a symbolic event reflecting what happens to everything that would come into contact with Shelly and Dave. When Shelly introduced Dave to her daughters, she asked them to refer to him as their father. Early in their relationship, Dave promised Shelly he would save their house from being possessed. Despite his efforts, her grandmother's house eventually went into foreclosure. Dave bought Shelly and her children a house after she lied about having cancer and only a short time to live. Shelly used this fake illness to manipulate them for years. Their marriage was violent, abusive, and frequently ended up in fights where Dave was left ridiculed and humiliated. Shelly's goal was to break Dave down so he would obey and serve her every whim. Shelly abused Dave both physically and emotionally in front of friends and family. She forced him to sleep outside, mimicking how her grandmother had treated her own husband. Over time, Dave's will broke down. He began to agree to everything Shelly demanded. With Dave fully under her control, Shelly then turned her attention to her own children. It didn't take much to set Shelly off, sometimes nothing at all. While exact dates are hard to pinpoint, the abuse against Nikki and Samantha likely began around early 1984 when Nikki was 9 and Samantha was 5. They moved into another house, which was extremely secluded. Their previous house had mysteriously burned to the ground, a recurring pattern with the Knoteks. Even with the ongoing abuse, Shelly and Dave got married on December 28, 1987, and moved to Raymond. Shelly was 29 and already on her third husband. Shelly started verbally abusing her daughters, telling them that they were worthless and would never amount to anything. One of her tactics to destroy them mentally was giving gifts only to take them back moments later. Most of the torture was aimed at Nikki, though Samantha also faced abuse, and this abuse slowly grew from verbal to physical. Shelly used household items to hit them, forcing the girls to wear clothing to school to conceal their bruises. On one occasion, Shelly threw Nikki against a fence with protruding nails. Both Nikki and Samantha, young and impressionable, believed they deserved the abuse. Shelly would then act extremely sweet and caring afterwards, feigning concern for their injuries, until she resumed the abuse only a few hours later. This treatment made them confused, guarded, and too shy to make friends at school. The one single occasion a year where Shelly would act like a real parent was during Christmas dinner. On Christmas Day, the girls were showered with good food, presents, and what seemed like a normal time for a happy family. But that time of relative peace wouldn't ever last long. One Christmas, after a nice dinner and giving the girls presents that included pins, which spilled on the floor when the girls opened their presents, Shelly beat them with an electric cord for hours until they had gathered up all the pins. It was normal for Shelly to ban the girls from using the shower or the bathroom for several days if she felt she was being disobeyed or disrespected. Nikki suffered the brunt of Shelly's abuse, and in one sadistic punishment Shelly nicknamed wallowing, she would wake Nikki up, strip her down, lead her outside to squat in a mud patch, and have Dave hose her down, regardless of the temperature. Shelly would then scream at Nikki, calling her a dirty pig, and force her to bathe in scalding hot water while berating her the entire time. These sessions lasted minutes or hours, and sometimes Samantha was forced to watch. Shelly often confined Nikki to her room, the bathroom, or a closet. She forced Nikki to use a bucket for bodily functions. Samantha was sometimes allowed to empty this bucket, but Nikki was forbidden from contacting anyone else. On one occasion, Nikki's head was put through the glass in the kitchen door after she was freed from what she called her prison sentence. Shelly would frequently hurt her in ways that would wound her, often treating to her wounds at home that should have been checked out by a doctor. As the years passed and Shelly realized what she could get away with, the abuse only continued to spread. In 1988, her 13-year-old nephew, Shane Watson, would find himself homeless with nowhere to go. Shelly officially adopted him under her care to earn a stipend from social services. Shane also had a rough upbringing with a mother who had problems with substance abuse and a father, Shelly's brother, Paul Watson, who abandoned him at a very young age. Despite everything he'd been through, Shane tried his best to stay out of trouble. He liked to tell jokes and keep everyone around him laughing. While he lived in the Knotek household, he made a large group of friends at school with a few girlfriends. Shelly would shower him with love and affection, initially leading him to trust her so much he'd refer to her as Mom and Dave as Dad. He was thankful to have a roof over his head and hot food every day, but with Shelly, nothing came without repercussions. Shane was put to work maintaining the house, and if Shelly wasn't satisfied with his work, she'd take his pillow, blanket, and bed away. Eventually, he found himself sleeping on the floor, and complaining only meant that he'd have his clothes and shower privileges taken away. He went from the cool, new boy to the smelly, greasy, and weird boy in school. Shane had tried to escape multiple times, but Shelly would always enlist the entire family to search for him. She would then coax him back by pretending to be apologetic and loving. Shelly's torture took a more sinister turn when punishing Nikki and Shane, both 15. She'd tell them to strip down naked and slow dance and encourage Dave and Samantha to watch. She'd also make them sit naked outside in the freezing cold for hours. Shelly had developed a deep fascination not only with controlling her victims, but also with humiliating them, stripping away their identity and making them completely dependent on her. Neither would dare complain about what was going on in the house to any outside party. Nikki even sometimes made excuses for her mother's behavior, suggesting that she was doing this out of love. Much like Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding can cause victims to stay with and even defend their abusers. On Christmas 1988, Shelly found herself pregnant with her third child and asked her best friend, Kathy, to move in with her. Kathy Loreno was a recently out-of-work hairdresser in her early 30s and couldn't afford to keep her house any longer. Kathy was not a bad person. In fact, she was known to be charitable. Growing up, she would babysit her neighbors' kids for free if they didn't have the money, help the poor when she could, and was generally well liked by everyone in her community. As she grew up, Kathy was known to be outspoken, friendly, and fun, which makes what happens to her next much more devastating. At first, Kathy was welcomed as a friend in need. Dave and Shelly even went so far as to decorate her room with some of her favorite things. But nothing came free with Shelly, and the payments she would demand would not be financial, but otherwise costly. Kathy was tasked with babysitting all the children. She was told Nikki and Shane were troubled kids who did drugs. In reality, the teenagers sometimes snuck a cigarette or two, and were once caught with marijuana. She was unaware of the abuse Shelly subjected them to. Meanwhile, Shelly's cancer lie prevailed, so it was a shock to everyone that she could become pregnant while undergoing chemotherapy. With Kathy as her new servant and unpaid babysitter, Tori Knotek would enter this world prematurely on June 1989. Even as a helpless little baby, Tori would not be free from Shelly's abuse. Nikki noted one time walking in on her mother holding a pillow over Tori's head and then later saying that Tori stopped breathing, but she was able to resuscitate her. She'd put on a show of caring for the baby when others were around, but Kathy took a large role in taking care of Tori, especially while Shelly pretended to go for cancer treatment. Shelly's stepmother, Lynette, worked in the medical field and knew many oncologists. When she tried to get more details about Shelly's supposed cancer, she was often stonewalled by Shelly, Kathy, and Dave, usually following Shelly's direct orders. Shelly would tell Kathy and Dave what to say, and if Kathy messed up with keeping up Shelly's lies, she'd beat her with anything she could get her hands on, till Kathy started to cry. This abuse was often followed by Shelly telling Kathy how much she loved her, and Kathy crying and apologizing to Shelly. Kathy became a shell of a human, just like everyone Shelly would develop a relationship with. At times, Shelly would get one of the children to hide food under Kathy's bed while she slept, and in the mornings fight with her and tell her she had an eating disorder. This would eventually escalate to Kathy being accused of trying to sexually assault Shane, kick down a flight of stairs, and having all her personal items and clothes being confiscated, leaving her with just a single set of clothes and underwear to wear. Kathy was eventually not allowed to use the shower or toilet without permission. If she did want to clean herself, it had to be in the garden with a hose. The kids wouldn't bat an eye. In fact, they were pushed to participate. These punishments were something they were completely used to and victims of after all. If they ever had to travel outside in a car together, Kathy would be stuffed in the trunk. Kathy had stopped resisting and accepted her fate. It was later found out that she was also being drugged with Prozac, which raises questions about whether or not the kids were being drugged as well. This abuse went on for several years. It wasn't long after that Shelly Knotek graduated to murder. In 1992, the Knoteks moved to a fixer-upper 4-bedroom farmhouse. This house was smaller than their previous one. Shane would sleep in Nikki's closet with just a blanket, and Kathy was forced to sleep either on the living room floor or in the pump house, a building meant to house chickens and horses. She was not allowed to shower with water anymore, and instead had her hands and feet bound with duct tape, held down by Dave or Shane, and then washed with bleach. By this time, she had lost more than 100 pounds, a lot of her teeth and most of her will. Her body was also completely covered in bruises, cuts, and sores. After she was caught trying to flee a few times, Shelly became even more enraged. The violence increased until she was being physically assaulted, kicked, punched, and shoved against a pavement by both Shelly and Dave nearly every day. Her health began to rapidly deteriorate. She couldn't really speak. One side of her face had started to droop. She could barely stand up, and Shelly, much to the objection of everyone around her, was against getting her any medical attention. From all the abuse, it was clear that Kathy was suffering from some sort of brain damage. She was completely dependent on help from others to move around, help she would never get. One night, at some time in 1994, Kathy was found completely lifeless by Dave. She had choked on her own vomit, unable to move due to the damage to her body and organs. Dave burnt Kathy's body along with her possessions because, he said, it was a respectful thing to do, and he scattered her ashes at a nearby beach. Dave didn't want to call the ambulance or the police, fearing they'd discover what went on in the house and his family would be torn apart. Shelly and Dave panicked and needed an alibi for Kathy's family, who were asking about her. They concocted a plan, telling Kathy's family she had run off with a man named Rocky and didn't want to communicate with anyone from her past life. Shelly was so prepared with her cover story that she even forged letters to fabricate a relationship between Kathy and this man. Their backup plan was to blame Shane if authorities were to discover what really happened, but Shelly later on would try to convince everyone that Kathy had taken her own life. Shane had photographed Kathy before her demise while she endured malnourishment and abuse in a frigid basement located alongside a radiator. After revealing the pictures to Nikki, he explained his intentions to present them to authorities. Overwhelmed by fear and worry about what could happen next, Nikki shared the troubling images with her mother. Seeking revenge, Shelly instructed Dave to shoot Shane in the head, which he did without hesitation around February 1995. His body, like Kathy's, was burned and his ashes spread on the same beach. The couple told everyone that Shane had run away and decided to move to Alaska to pursue his dreams of fishing on a boat there. But Nikki and Samantha wondered, why weren't they looking for him like they had all the other times? The family broke apart for a few years after Nikki, the main focus of the torture, ran away, followed by Samantha. Nikki lived her life independently for the first time. At 21, she found a job at a care center Lynette was working for. However, Shelly tried everything to get her fired. From anonymous calls to the center claiming patients were being abused, to Dave showing up at the center parking lot in a threatening manner. Dave lived in a tent by his job site in Payne Fields because he sent his entire paycheck home to Shelly. Samantha decided to move in with her long-term high school boyfriend. Tori was unfortunately too young to legally be without her mother, so the abuse was shifted to her, and she was put through the same thing her sisters and the others went through. She was also told to strip naked and cut off her pubic hair so Shelly could inspect her body for puberty progress. Shelly tried to convince Tori that this was normal for mothers and daughters to do, but Tori, who was barely a teenager at the time, knew it was anything but. Unfortunately for Tori, Shelly had already succeeded in pushing everyone else away. However, there was one glimmer of hope on the horizon for Tori, although it would come at the expense of another person. In 2001, Shelly had surprisingly landed a job as a caseworker for an agency that provides assistance to seniors and adults with disabilities. This is where she met a 55-year-old man named Ronald Woodworth. Ronald was a former stockbroker who had fallen on hard times. He was a very bright man with an interest in history and a degree in Egyptology, but he felt vulnerable after a recent separation with his partner and financial struggles brought on by his inability to find employment. He became entangled with Shelly Knotek, who initially offered him a place to stay. However, this gesture of kindness quickly turned into a nightmare. Similar to Kathy's experience, Ronald was given a cozy room complete with all of his belongings, and Shelly would frequently shower him with affection and prepare delicious meals until Ron came to think of Shelly as a close friend. He went through the same process as the others, where over the following months, Shelly slowly turned on him. Eventually, Ron was being forced to take a handful of sleeping pills every night and limited to eating plain toast and water twice a day. He was forced to sleep on the floor of the computer room and was made to work 18 to 20 hours a day. He wasn't allowed to use the bathroom inside and had to relieve himself outside in the garden only if Shelly gave him permission. He wasn't allowed clothes or shoes and had to wear tattered underwear everywhere. Shelly punished him for disobeying her orders. On one occasion, she forced him to jump barefoot from a second-story roof onto gravel. After that incident, Shelly claimed she was giving him medical treatment. However, she poured boiling water and pure bleach onto his injured feet, causing severe pain and further damage. Nikki discovered what was happening to Ronald and, anticipating the path Shelly was going down, she confided in Lynette and also told the police that her mother had murdered Kathy. The person responsible, Deputy Bergstrom, was very slow to act on this, however, as the local police were involved with another trial. Ronald could have potentially been saved if the police did begin an investigation. Nikki had discussed this with Samantha as well, who was really only concerned what would happen to her mother if the police were to arrest her. Samantha, who was an adult now, was defending her mother and giving her the benefit of the doubt, but we should remember that Samantha's life was completely shaped and molded by abuse. Extreme psychological manipulation and abuse can give someone immense control over others, even adults, for extended periods, which seemed to be the case for Samantha. Ronald's body started to fail, his brain deteriorating just like Kathy's. Tori later reported that, in the end, Ronald smelled like rotten flesh. Tragically, after 3 years of torture and abuse by Shelly, Ronald passed away. His exact cause of death is unknown, but was thought to be due to the pain he went through at Shelly's hands. Before he passed, Shelly pressured Ronald to tell his mother he never wanted to see her again, and Shelly told Tori that Ronald was planning to run away. Due to this, nobody found it strange when Ronald was nowhere to be found. With Ronald's death, the torture of Tori only worsened. One particularly bad punishment for Tori involved Shelly dragging her outside, locking her inside a dog kennel filled with feces, and spraying the hose on full blast into the kennel, causing the feces to go everywhere, including all over Tori's face and into her mouth. Tori knew that she had to tell someone, because nothing about what was happening to her was normal. When Shelly found Ron's body, she immediately called Dave and told him to come home and help her deal with it. To get Tori out of the way, Shelly sent her to stay with her sister, Samantha. Shelly wanted Tori out of the house so they could manage Ron's body without her interference. However, what Shelly didn't anticipate is that Nikki was visiting Samantha as well, and that the three sisters would be together after several years. When Tori revealed that she was being abused, Nikki and Samantha were heartbroken and couldn't believe it. They thought Tori would be safe. Determined to protect their little sister, they decided they couldn't let her return to the house and suffer at Shelly's hands. The three sisters went to the police station and refused to leave until they were heard. Unlike Nikki's experience a few years earlier, this time they were taken seriously. They provided the police with harrowing accounts of their experiences with Shelly, detailing the abuse they had seen inflicted on Kathy, Shane, and Ronald. The police immediately contacted Shelly and Dave, informing them that CPS was taking Tori away and an investigation was being opened. When Shelly found out, she was in shock. She couldn't believe that her daughters, whom she thought she controlled completely, had gone against her. She ordered Dave to go to the police station, expecting him to manage the situation and bring Tori back. However, as soon as Dave arrived, he was dragged into an interview. Overwhelmed with guilt, he confessed to everything: the abuse of the children and the deaths of Kathy, Shane, and Ron. Following this, both Dave and Shelly were finally arrested on the 8th of August, 2003. The abuse of Nikki had started back in the 1980s, meaning this had gone on for decades. Despite the arrests, the case faced significant challenges. There were no bodies of Kathy or Shane, and although they had Ron's body, the cause of his death couldn't be proven. The police primarily had the testimonies of Dave and the children, but Dave soon stopped cooperating with the police. There was actually one more suspicious death linked to Shelly. At some point, Shelly managed to insert herself into the life of an elderly war veteran named James McClintock, who went by the name Mac. Shelly became his registered caregiver and manipulated him into changing his will. In the will, he left his entire estate to Shelly. Tragically, not long after the will was changed, Mac was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead. It was found that he died from blunt force trauma to the head, but his death was ruled an accident, and no investigation was made. Shelly then inherited his $145,000 estate. Although it was never proven that Mac was a victim of Shelly's, the circumstances are very coincidental. Fearing they wouldn't have enough evidence to convict Shelly, the prosecution offered a plea deal. Dave pleaded guilty to second-degree murder of Shane, and Shelly pleaded guilty to second-degree murder of Kathy and manslaughter for Ronald. In return, Dave received only 15 years in prison, and Shelly got 22 years. Dave served 13 years of his sentence and was paroled in 2016, and Shelly was released in November 2022. The public were outraged with the outcome, given the severity of their crimes. While Dave may have started as a victim, his actions throughout the case are inexcusable. As for Shelly, many believe that she should have never been released from prison. She has been a danger to society from a very young age, with her manipulative and abusive behavior starting as early as 6 years old. She could still be a danger to others. She seems to be a case of someone born with pure evil, her actions defying any attempt at understanding. Thank you for listening to this case. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, like and comment on this video.